Hey there, folks. No time for preamble. Let's talk about the brain. First off, we're going to talk about just the basic pattern of the central nervous system. Remember, the central nervous system includes the spinal cord and the brain. Throughout the central nervous system, there's kind of a central cavity, and that's surrounded by a gray matter core, which remember what we talked about, gray matter versus white matter. External to that gray matter core in the spinal cord, there's white matter, and that's the stuff that's composed up of the myelinated fibers. Okay. And that actually continues on into the brain, which I don't think these words explain very well. So let's just take a picture here, or look at a picture here. So you got this central cavity in the spinal cord. Then you have this gray matter that kind of surrounds it. Looks like a beautiful butterfly. And then outside of that, you have the white matter that surrounds that. And as you go up into the brainstem, you see that that's still reflected here, right? You have a little bit more gray matter starting to pop up in places. Then once you get into the brain, you'll see that there's another cortex of gray matter, like a rind, I guess you could call it, if you think about cheese, of gray matter that starts surrounding that outer white matter, which is still surrounding that inner gray matter and that central cavity. All right. So that's just the kind of general structure that you'll see consistent throughout the central nervous system. There are a couple of things here just to help us get us oriented. This right here is honestly kind of unnecessarily confusing to look at, so don't stress about this if this is not making any sense. If you're looking in your book, a lot of the stuff that they talk about is in terms of the embryonic development. We'll talk about like the telencephalon, the diencephalon, which actually does still make sense. But like the mesencephalon, all of these right here, they're not necessarily requisite knowledge for this course. But your brain talks about it, so I wanted to just point it out. This is basically just embryonic development. It all consistently turns into these different things, and it has these canals, these ventricles throughout the brain that your book uses as an orientation method. So I just wanted to make sure that I pointed this out, and you have these at your disposal if you see something and you're not sure what it's talking about. This is all I was talking about here, okay? And you can see the embryonic development as well here, where the brain comes, and you have these different flexures here. And it is really interesting for sure, but I fear that it's a bit outside of what we are going to be getting into for this course. So I wanted to make sure that you didn't feel burdened with that. Okay, and then this is the other thing, the ventricles that I was talking about. These are just empty cavities in the brain. And it's actually really interesting how these are structured as well. But they are numbered. Like this is the third ventricle, lateral ventricle, the fourth ventricle that runs all the way down into the brainstem. All of these parts here are just for orientation. We don't need to have them memorized, okay? All right, so there are three major parts of the brain. There's the cerebrum, this big part up here. Then you have the cerebellum. Then you have the brainstem. Okay. We're going to, I believe, start off with the cerebrum. Yep. So we have the cerebral hemispheres. That makes up 83% of the total mass of the brain. It's pretty tremendous. It has ridges, which those are called, individually they're called gyruses, and they're called gyri or gyri. When you're looking at all of them. Then shallow grooves, which are sulcus as singular and sulci as plural. Then deep grooves, or the shallow grooves, sulci, but the deep grooves are called fissures. Okay, there's a longitudinal fissure that runs all the way down the brain. Then within the cerebral hemispheres, there are three basic regions. You have the cortex, white matter, and the basal nuclei. We'll take a look at some of these. So the cerebral hemisphere has deep sulci that divide the hemispheres into 5 lobes. You have the frontal, the parietal, temporal, occipital, and the insula. Okay. The central sulcus that separates the frontal and the parietal lobes. These aren't things you need to memorize. This is for kind of color commentary, I suppose. All right. So you can see, weirdly enough, it actually matches pretty well along with the bones that we've memorized and the muscles that we've talked about. You got the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe. It's interesting how that keeps coming back. Here's what we're talking about with the sulcus and the gyrus, though. We have the sulcus. It's just this kind of, I guess, one down, whereas a fissure goes much deeper. Can that go away? Go away. There we go. The fissure goes deep into the brain, and the gyrus is just the elevated part here, the ridge line, basically. Okay. So then you can see the insula in here when you pull these the temporal apart from the frontal lobe. You can see that in there. But again, these aren't necessarily things that you need to have memorized. Just wanted to give you a bit of background on this. Okay. You know what? Actually, don't worry again too much about this. You've got the sulcus just divides these different regions up, right? So parieto, occipital, that's the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe is divided there, right? Lateral, yeah, we don't have these memorized, just giving you some background here, all right? Okay, so the actual cerebral cortex, remember the cortex is basically the, you think of like the rind on cheese or something like that. That's what this is, okay? The cortex is the superficial gray matter of the cerebrum, and that accounts for 40% of the mass of the entire brain. Yeah, it's pretty significant. That's what enables sensation, communication, memory, any of those kind of higher level thinking things that we talk about, right? And then we say that each hemisphere, they work contralaterally. Okay? So like the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, okay, and vice versa. These hemispheres are also not completely equal in function. They act a little bit differently. And nothing acts completely on its own. There isn't, like, that's not really how the brain works. It's a very connected system, all right? There isn't, like, you take out one part of it and you're no longer able to do something. You may not be able to do something quite as well, but there's not any conscious behavior that can be stopped just by attacking one part of the cerebral cortex. Okay, there are three functional areas that we generally refer to with the cerebral cortex. You have the motor area, the sensory areas, and the association areas. Motor obviously controls, your movement, which is what motor means. Sensory areas, that's any sensation that you're aware of consciously. There are other areas that deal with sensory issues of like subconscious or unconscious. And then you also have association areas, and that's that integration piece of the nervous system that we talked about. You can see here, this is not nothing too crazy, but you can see this is kind of the integration. Then you have the sensory, then you have the motor up here. Okay. And again, this is you can see just how many different things there are. You don't need to have like the Broca's area. You don't need to be able to identify that or anything. This is just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Okay. And Kona has joined me. Yeah, you'll need to know some of the things on here, but I'm not going to point them out just yet out of fear of being overwhelming right now. All right. So you got the cerebral white matter. Okay. That is deep to the cerebral cortex. That's the myelinated fibers and their different tracks, right? And that's the kind of the telephone lines, basically, between the cerebral cortex and the central nervous system, the lower central nervous system, and other areas of the cerebrum, right? You can see here how these fibers run, basically connecting all these different regions, run up and down, and they run down here into the lower cerebrum. You can actually see it. It's kind of interesting how well you can actually see it on this picture here too. How these fibers run up and down the brain. It's pretty interesting. All right. Then you have the basal nuclei. And those are masses of gray matter found deep within the cortical white matter. You got three parts that we're looking at. Again, these are not necessarily things you need to have memorized. I will be sure to emphasize when there's something extraordinarily important. But you have the caudate nucleus, which caudate, that means tail. So like nucleus, tail, the tail of the nucleus. All right. lentiform nucleus. I don't know. I feel like they can't be the same root as lentils, but I don't actually know. And then you have fibers that run between those two nuclei, right? So you can see the caudate nucleus here. And then it actually says the tail of the caudate nucleus, which makes me think of like when people say ATM machine, where it's automated teller machine, or your PIN number, your personal identification number, the tail of the tail nucleus. And you can see the same thing here. And you can see like where it says third ventricle, that's that image from before where you can see, just to give you an idea of where we are, you can see that ventricle here as well, where there's the empty space in the brain. Okay. All right. So the basal nuclei, that's plays a significant role in influencing muscular activity, regulating attention. It's got it's also important in like stopping unnecessary movement where your body might want to do that. Okay. Diencephalon. So this is one of those parts that we were talking about at the beginning with the embryonic development. This is just one of those ways that the book, or honestly a lot of places utilize to describe, because this structure remains intact pretty clearly. Di, generally, when we use di, it means two, but in this situation, it actually comes from dia, as in diameter, like to across. So this works across the brain. Okay. So this is the central core of the forebrain. And that has a couple of three paired structures. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, which hypo means below, and the thalamus is the thalamus. And then epi is upon or around the thalamus. All right. So you have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. We're not too worried about the epithalamus, just the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And I think I've said the word thalamus enough times now that it just doesn't really feel like a word anymore to me. Okay. And this encloses that third ventricle, I believe. Yeah, you'll see a picture here. So this right here, you have the thalamus. And then this right here is the hypothalamus. That leads down here to the pituitary gland. And you have the mammillary body. And this is where we get down to the brainstem, but we're not there yet just yet. All right. So that's what we're looking at, this area right here. We're talking about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so the thalamus, it's paired egg-shaped masses, and those form the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle. Again, don't stress too much about that. This is just you do need to know about the thalamus, but you don't need to be able to tell me that it's in the third ventricle. You need to be able to point it out on the diagram. You need to tell me the purpose of it. Okay. And I included this picture because, I don't know, it looks like, just looks fun. It's really what it comes down to. You don't need to know the different nuclei that make it all up. Just that's where it comes from. Okay. So this is the more important part here. The thalamic function, the function of it is for sensual afferent impulses, which, remember, afferent, right? Coming at the brain. The sensual afferent impulses conversion synapse in the thalamus. That's where they all kind of come together. And that's the thalamus sorts it all out. And think of it as like the video editor that puts everything together before actually sending it out as a finished product. And that it's basically a mediator for this kind of thing. Okay, for any kind of sensory input. Okay, then we have the hypothalamus. That's just below the thalamus, obviously. Hypo meaning below, and that it kind of tops off the brainstem, and that forms the lower and side walls of the third ventricle, the inferolateral, right? Infero, but comes from inferior, and lateral is in lateral. As the mammillary bodies, which don't stress about that, the infundibulum, that's the stalk of the hypothalamus, and that's what connects to the pituitary gland. Okay, and that's the visceral control center of the body, the infundibulum. The pituitary gland is a very important gland for the endocrine system. And this one looks like Christmas lights, which was just super fun. This is the hypothalamus, and then you can see the pituitary gland down here. Okay, and this just has all kinds of different nuclei that are just hanging out in here, which, again, you don't need to be too stressed about those. Okay, so the hypothalamus, the function of it, it regulates the blood pressure, your heartbeat, digestive tract, a lot of really important stuff. Your hypothalamus is also where your a lot of base emotions, pleasure, fear, and rage come from. This is where your body temperature is maintained, any kind of, basically like any kind of homeostasis emotion or task that your body has. It stems from the hypothalamus. So these will be good to know. And this is where the pituitary gland comes in. You have endocrine functions of the hypothalamus. That is, the hypothalamus is where it controls the secretion of hormones from the pituitary gland. You have these other couple of nuclei that produce ADH and oxytocin. Interesting thing about ADH, that's anti-diuretic hormone. And this is actually, if you've ever heard anybody who's drinking say they don't want to break the seal, that's like when they go to the bathroom after they've been drinking, people fear that like there's some kind of magic thing that makes you just have to keep going to the bathroom after you've been drinking, and that's not actually what happens. Alcohol actually impacts the production of ADH, and so that's just a matter of building it up over time, and you just need to pee after a while. So then you have the brainstem is the next thing that we're going to talk about. And that has three regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Just the most fun word in, I think, maybe the whole world, but definitely in this slideshow, the medulla oblongata. So this is really similar to the spinal cord, but it's more up. It also has embedded nuclei, whereas the spinal cord doesn't really have that. It has it is where the automatic behaviors for survival. This is like the lizard brain that I may have mentioned in class. It's just the very basic lizard brain kind of stuff for you to survive. This is the pathway for the higher and lower brain centers. This is also where 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that you'll need to know are associated. Let me see. Here's a fun picture. You can see that's an optic nerve. That's one of the nerves you need. You got the oculomotor nerve. You have the trochlear nerve. What else? Hypoglossal, below, glossal, tongue. So the below tongue nerve here. The accessory nerve, the vagus nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, facial nerve, abducens, trigeminal. I think that's all the ones that are pointed out on here. Basically, any of the ones that has the Roman numeral next to it, those are nerves that you need to know. But I have a table and a better graphic at the end of this slideshow, so don't stress if this is a bit too much for you right now. But so this is what we're looking at when we're looking at the brainstem. Okay, so here's the thalamus, where we were at before, right? Here's the pons. Do I have another? Yeah. You see the pons here, right? Thalamus. You have all these nerves again. And then I believe there's one more picture. Yep. So you've got here is the midbrain, this whole area here. Okay, you can see that's midbrain. This is the pons, this area right here. And then the medulla oblongata right here. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about these. Got one more. So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Okay. And you can see how this actually fits into the brain. You have the cerebrum, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Okay. So the midbrain, it is called the midbrain because it is midway between the diencephalon and the pons, which really just makes sense. Don't worry about these structures in there. Just know that that's where the midbrain is, right? You have the pons. That's the bulging region in the brainstem. That's between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. This is the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle, the front wall of that last part there. And it has, this is another place where the higher brain centers and the spinal cord are connected. Okay. And then the medulla oblongata, which again, just the best term. Medulla comes from like core, or like it means like the pith, like of a fruit or something like that. And then oblongata just means oblong. That's all it means. So it's just like the oblong core. All right. And this is the most inferior part of the brainstem, and going along with that pons, it forms that ventral wall of the fourth ventricle. It has these pyramids, which they cross over, and they just, I cannot tell you guys enough that anatomists just hate any kind of student of anatomy, because there's the decussation of pyramids, which just means where the pyramids cross. But don't worry about that. Just know that this is where it is. All right. All right. So now we're done with the brainstem. We're going to talk about the cerebellum. I don't know if anybody ever watched Powerpuff Girls, or currently watches Powerpuff Girls. The assistant to the mayor, her name is Miss Sarah Bellum. And that's kind of a pretty clever joke about basically how the activity at City Hall runs. So this is located dorsal, behind the pons and the medulla. You can see it kind of protruding under the occipital lobe. This is 11% of the brain's mass, so it's a significant part, just not the lion's share of it. This is where how you're able to have your skeletal muscle contract so finely, so particularly so well tuned to what you need it to do. And all of the activity here occurs subconsciously. It's not something that you're necessarily aware of on a regular basis. So with this, the main thing that you need to know out of the anatomy of the cerebellum is the arbor vitae, which I believe I have another picture in here, which arbor means tree, vitae means life. So this is the tree of life, which you may see why it's called that in a moment here. So this right here is the arbor vitae. You can see it does look remarkably just like a tree, and it makes sense that since it's here, that it would be called the tree of life. That it's here in the brain where so much of our subconscious brain power lies. It actually is pretty incredible that it looks like that. And that's all you need to know really about the cerebellum's anatomy. So this receives the impulses from the rest of the body, and that's to initiate the voluntary muscle contraction. Proprioceptors, those are basically like how you know where you are in space. Like if you think about, like if you lift up your arm, you don't necessarily need to be looking at your arm to see that to feel that your arm is lifted up, right? And that's a proprioceptor is the kind of receptor that tells you that, right? But there are also visual signals that tell your cerebellum about like where your body is in space and what it's currently doing. Then it calculates the best way to do that. And then it basically just executes. It's a pretty impressive process. It also has a bit of a role in cognitive function, like in language and problem solving. This is a kind of how, like if you're trying to catch a ball or something, you more or less are doing a kind of calculus to figure out where that ball is going to be by the time that you are moving your body into position. And that's where the cerebrum comes in, or the cerebellum comes in. Okay, here are these nerves. This is more or less the diagram that you'll need to be able to label, Okay, I actually really like this diagram. So you've got the olfactory, you've got the optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, glossopharyngeal, vestibulocochlear, hypoglossal, uh, glossopharyngeal, the vagus nerve, the hypoglossal, and the accessory nerve. Okay, you can see if this image looks better to you over here, you can use this one as well. You need to know all of the names of these. I won't ask you which one is cranial nerve 3. That's not going to be something I ask. It'll be like, where is oculomotor nerve 3? Something like I would give you this and ask you which one is that one. Or if you take a look at this next slide here where it has the functions, this might be another thing that I ask. Okay, so olfactory, which that's just good to know that olfactory means smell anyway. But then optic, you know that. Oculomotor, you could probably figure that one out. Ocu, as in sight or eyes, and then motor, movement. So that's the one that moves the eyes. The trochlear, maybe a little bit less obvious. That moves the eyes as well. Trigeminal, that's with chewing. The abducens, it's another one that may not be as easy to remember, but that's eyes. So you think oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, those are all about eyes. Facial nerve, it's obviously facial expressions. Vestibulocochlear, which we haven't really talked about. You think like a cochlear implant, that has to do with hearing. Then you think the vestibular cochlear, like your sense of equilibrium is all kept in the ear, more or less. So that's a sense of equilibrium, and hearing is associated with the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then you have the glossopharyngeal, that's the pharynx, and the tongue, right? That's like the space right behind your tongue. Then you have the vagus nerve, that's your major organs and your viscera, right? Your accessory, we'll just narrow it down to just shoulders. And then the hypoglossal, below the tongue, right? So that runs up to the tongue, and that controls the tongue, right? So you need to have these memorized, the functions, and then the actual locations of each of these. You need to know where that is for your cranial nerve quiz and for the test. Okay. I will try to get these put up on Quizlet as soon as possible. You are still responsible for these on your own. Okay.